Follow the news, and particularly under Trump administration, starting the battle against the illegal immigrants, and all the way to today, this battle against the Harvard University. Some say that Trump is an interrupter, but according to the Washington Post and one of the well-known news media, that shows Donald Trump is showing this what they called unorthodox diplomacy. Well, when we come to diplomacy, how much does Donald Trump actually understand? Now, make no mistake, recently, the sitting US president quickly wrapped up the trip in the Middle East. And not only that the news came out of the media, the multiple agreement was signed in order to strengthen this policy or regulation from the US perspective. But it's another approach to understand what is the future between US and the Middle East. And even though Donald Trump did not mention the nation of Iran on purpose, or perhaps even came in the conversation, that doesn't say that Trump is now thinking about making a deal of Iran. Middle East is rather crucial for Iran, for US, and particularly for China. Now this time, Donald Trump surely ruffled some feathers, and especially when we talk about this unorthodox diplomacy. How do we understand that? And is the world ready for Donald Trump's this unconventional approach or strategies to the Middle East, and even though it might be difficult? Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, who is the Professor Jamsheed Choksy. Professor Choksy is a political scientist, and he's an expert in the international affairs. And welcome, Professor Choksy, join the show to give us all the details. Well, Professor Choksy, and welcome back to The Missing Piece.
Thank you so much. Wonderful to be back here.
Well, Professor Choksy, again, as I mentioned in the intro, the trip for Donald Trump to visit Middle East this time was rather crucial. Now, again, I want to refer to the Washington Post, the editorial board, that referred Donald Trump's current diplomacy to international affairs or domestic issues is what they called unorthodox diplomacy. So from your perspective, Professor Choksy, how much do we understand Donald Trump's this unorthodox diplomacy, and what is your take on his trip in the Middle East? Was it successful, or could be something done better? Your thoughts?
That's a very good point. And essentially, traditionally, American foreign policy has been very well coordinated, carefully synchronized across levels of the US government, so that a presidential trip ultimately is not just carefully planned, but the agendas are laid out. Diplomats, various state officials on all sides, countries being visited and the United States, have carefully discussed agendas. The presidents tend, by and large, to stick to it. President Trump is different, shall we say. Ultimately, the negotiations, discussions flow as he wishes to, and he does not follow a script. And that is largely the unorthodox nature of how he operates. So what we have seen in Saudi Arabia, in Qatar, in other places, is that the trips, whether it is the physical setting or the transportation, let's say in golf carts to the state functions, etc., it has a certain aspect of theater. It is certainly always intended by President Trump to shine the spotlight on him. Now, leaving aside the orthodox or unorthodox nature of the way in which Trump does business, if we look at the trip as a whole, I think there are two major components. One is the reinforcement of bilateral relationships between the United States and the Gulf Arab states. And the second was to cement economic ties, essentially, as the president likes to say, to make deals. On the deals front, certainly we see that there's been quite a bit of deal signing, defense contract quite a bit. But we've also seen that essentially there's a, shall we say, a strengthening of bilateral ties between the United States and the Arab nations of the Persian Gulf, uh, and uh, they, and and may I observe that even though President Trump threatened to rename the Persian Gulf before he left, that didn't actually come up on the trip. So there's a lot of theater there. But in reality, also, what the difference between the Trump and Biden administrations is the Trump administration is not interested in each country's domestic politics. It is all about the relationship with the United States and more specifically, the relationship with the Trump administration. And so, in that sense, it was successful.
Well, Professor Choksy, you mentioned that, of course, Donald Trump paid a short visit to Qatar, but one thing that during the press conference, he was very confident, and again, I use the word theatrical. This theatrical performance, especially in front of media, he boldly claimed, and I quote, "I can settle anything," end quote. Now, let's keep that in mind. But meanwhile, let's bring the nation of Iran into our conversation. Again, a well-known commentator from CNN News wrote the opinion piece, and this is what he wrote, and based on Donald Trump's confidence, should we say. It says that Trump has also repeatedly suggested that Trump administration is willing to make a nuclear deal with Iran. If so, Trump could bring a new level of peace and stability to the Middle East. I mean, Professor Choksy, you are the expert. We know that how much Trump enjoyed the spotlight and how much Trump enjoyed this attention. But when it comes to Iran, this flip-flop deal has been rather unpredictable. On one hand, he threatens Iran with all things are possible. But right now, he believes that he can settle anything and reshape the stability of the Middle East. Who is actually bluffing at this moment? Is Trump bluffing, or is Iran actually going to understand and willing to accept that this reshape of the stability in the Middle East? What do you say to that?
I would say that it is not so much that Trump is bluffing, it is more grandstanding and as you put it, theater, and also in some ways a lack of patience. We've seen this also with the negotiations between Russia, Ukraine, and the Trump's involvement, where the president of the United States expects that he can clinch a deal very quickly, and perhaps in so doing underestimates the complexities involved when negotiating either directly or indirectly with a country like Iran, or being part of a tripartite negotiations with Ukraine and Russia. Back to Iran, I think we are seeing that essentially the bottom line for Trump is that Iran not have a nuclear weapon. And let us modify that and say, well, at least not have a nuclear weapon during Trump's lifetime. In other words, if he can come up with a deal that kicks the nuclear can down the road by 15 or 20 years, then Trump will claim this to be a great victory. So, is there an opportunity for a deal? Oh, yes. I would say this is essentially, if you wish to, and the US president likes gold, as you've seen. Golden domes, golden this, golden that. So, shall we say, this is a golden opportunity for Iran to strike a deal. The Trump administration seems to be making it clear that they will not be opposed to Iran maintaining a civilian nuclear program. Iran's administration at various levels, from Iran's president to the foreign minister to the negotiators, have all indicated that Iran would be willing to freeze enrichment at the higher level and lower it down to civilian levels. So the Iranians seem to be flexible. In addition, what we've seen in the 5 rounds of negotiations so far is a movement from indirect negotiations to the latest negotiations in Rome, where there were both direct and indirect negotiations. So without much fanfare, the Iranian and American sides are actually sitting down together. So the dynamic has changed. Is there a possibility of a deal? Yes. Is it possible, however, that President Trump will run out of patience too soon and therefore scuttle everything? That is also clear. Uh, let's also keep in mind that on this Middle East trip, the president bolstered relationships with the Saudi royal family and with the other Gulf royal families, essentially offering them more security. But also let us keep in mind that these Gulf countries are no longer completely reliant on the United States for their security. They've reached out and they've branched out to Russia, to China. They're working multilaterally. And additionally, the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Qataris have all over the last few years worked towards rebuilding their own relations with Tehran. So the situation on the ground is one where the Gulf countries feel far less threatened by Iran's not just nuclear but military capabilities, partly because they are reaching their own understandings with Tehran. And as you and your listeners will keep in mind, on this trip, President Trump did not visit Israel. Essentially, at this point, he's almost sidelined Netanyahu, and he wishes, shall we say, to secure the prize of an Iran deal. He's trying the Iran deal, he's trying the Ukraine deal. I think President Trump wants an international win. And that, shall I say, is a strength, but it's also a weakness. And that's what would probably permit Iran to reach a deal if the Iranians also were willing to do so.
Professor Choksy, let's talk about this international win or international reputation. Again, when we look at, regardless dealing with Iran or China, again, running out of patience for Ukraine and Russia, one thing that we do know is the word time. It takes time to build relationship, and also it takes time to polish the diplomacy with adversaries and also with allies. But meanwhile, some experts believe, in addition to the international unpredictability of the relationship, another challenge for Trump is within administrations, it's heavily divided on those issues between the two parties. One party, it's called the realists, and the other party, it's called neoconservatives. And if I may, let's talk about the Trump's first term. I mean, for example, the well-known, should we say, international diplomat is John Bolton. John Bolton was a hardcore conservative, but when it comes to dealing with China, dealing with Iran, or any other countries, John Bolton has been very bold and outspoken by using the military strategy. But right now, we're looking at the people surrounding Donald Trump. It's not a hawkish diplomacy. It's more about let's being realistic, or let's try to be realistic as much as possible. So Professor Choksy, from your perspective, how do we understand the two camps between realists and neoconservative? And also keep in mind that this Middle East convoy, it's called Steve Witkoff. He's been working really hard and trying to maintain the stability in the Middle East. But again, we're seeing some difficulties, seeing some hurdles. So how do you think Trump can balance those relationships, and especially, how can I say, to distinguish between the noises and the signals within his own cabinet members when it comes to the Middle East?
And that's an excellent issue. There clearly are, shall we say, two large camps and then various individuals in between within the Trump administration. But I think to understand the Trump administration is to understand that there will be camps, there will be differences, but ultimately it comes down to Trump himself and what he wants, what he wants and the speed at which he wants it. So those are the strengths and the weaknesses. So yes, you will have those who do not want to deal with Iran, who'd rather bomb Iran, than those who want a deal. very clearly, the uh, the president of the United States feels that his image would benefit from a deal with Iran. He's often talked about wanting a Nobel Peace Prize, but certainly a deal with Iran is something he would then hold up as deserving the Nobel Peace Prize. So, however, again, his greatest weakness is lack of patience, as we have pointed out, and you have pointed out quite clearly. Diplomacy takes time. Trust has to be built. There are many pitfalls. So that, of course, can again be an advantage and a disadvantage. If the Iranians are willing to make sufficient concessions, and those concessions, let us keep in mind, do not have to be forever. Okay, there are always ends to deals, and so there can certainly be sunset clauses, as they're called, whereby the Iranians will say, okay, for the next 15 years, we will forego enrichment, etc. Something else also to keep in mind, that when Trump left the JCPOA in his first administration, and then when the second administration, Trump administration, began, there was a lot of discussion of a grand deal under which Iran would also have to abrogate its regional proxies, etc. There's no discussion of that now. The discussion is simply on nuclear. It's focused very narrowly, and in part granted because Iran has lost the power of many of its proxies. And the United States has been able to work out some agreements as well. So the United States and Iran's allies, the Houthis and the United States have an agreement now. But interestingly, that agreement does not extend to Israel. The Houthis continue to lob missiles at Israel. So it would appear that Trump is willing to go it alone to secure a deal that would benefit the United States and ultimately the Trump administration. So I think we should sort of see that there are these camps, but the camps are less important than Trump's own ambitions.
Professor Choksy, if I may, I would love to borrow a quote from the former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and he once said, "America always knows how to make the best decision after exhausting all the possibilities." Now, let's talk about what's happening. Again, what happened in the Middle East trip. It's another country that was crucial for Trump and also for the whole world, was Syria. I'm sure that Professor Choksy, you noticed that, and also you pay attention, that Trump made the news by lifting sanctions on Syria, and also was willing to work closely with the Syrian government. We know that this country, for Syria, has been going ups and downs back and forth. Now, there is a new sheriff in town, but the current leader, I want to be careful, has been questioned by the international community. Professor Choksy, from your perspective, was this a deal Donald Trump was looking for by lifting the sanction on Syria? I guess the simple question is, why did he do that? And also, at this moment, we still don't know the stability of the Syrian government. What card is Donald Trump, or was Donald Trump playing when he made the announcement? Your thoughts?
Yes. So let's keep in mind, in addition to the announcements, he actually met in person with the new leader of Syria, someone who until recently has been regarded as an international terrorist. So it's interesting how terrorists can become mainstreamed as politicians in time. That's a discussion for another time, I guess, between us. But it would appear that what Trump is doing is trying to ensure that the new Syrian government moves away from Iran. So the ouster of Assad removed a major ally from the Iranian regional geopolitical deck. by lifting sanctions, by being willing to recognize the new leader of Syria. The message Trump is trying to send to that Syrian administration is move away from Tehran. And of course, in so doing, then he's essentially weakening Tehran's regional allies. He's also clearly hoping that by lifting sanctions, by working with the Syrian regime, he can stabilize the Syrian regime because that regime is indeed very unstable, possibly close to chaos. There are rising tensions across Syria. And the great fear is that if Syria were to descend into another round of civil war, that once again would allow the Iranians to penetrate back into Syria like they did very, very tactfully when the Assad regime was facing its civil war. It would also permit Russia to return to the Syrian arena. So I think Trump was indeed making a strategic decision to try to move Syria as close to the United States, and also in some ways thereby tossing a bone, if you wish, to Israel, while ignoring Israel and Israeli wishes that he not negotiate with Iran. Trump, on the other hand, is also trying to, shall we say, help Israel by making sure that Syria is potentially less hostile. So I think he is playing a multidimensional regional strategy. I think we should not underestimate that. But I think we should also keep in mind that it is not, the United States is unfortunately or fortunately, I think from Trump's point of view, fortunately, no longer the main arbiter of events, external arbiter of events in the Middle East.
Professor Choksy, I have two more questions before letting you go. Now, let's bring China into our conversation. I'm sure that, as we mentioned before, Donald Trump's recent trip to the Middle East and indeed raised a lot of questions and in terms of accomplishments and also this successful deals, should we call it. But meanwhile, when we talk about Syria, when we talk about Iran, those two countries, I want to be careful, have been actively growing economically closer to China. And if I'm not mistaken, leaders, I mean, not the current one in Syria, but the previous regime paid a short visit to China. And also the Iranian leaders' representatives are constantly in close contact with the Chinese government. Well, it's all about this economic relationship, this mutual economic growth. So from your perspective, Professor Choksy, how do you think that Trump's recent move by lifting the sanctions of Syria, by willing to make a deal with Iran, and also, have the conversation with Qatar and Saudi Arabia, put everything together, how did the trip impact China from this global perspective? I mean, again, we are still seeing this growing attention between US and China, and despite the fact that both countries had a first round of talk and the tariffs were lowered than before, but it's still not on the same page or still not on good terms right now. How do you think that influenced the Chinese decision when we look at this global sense?
I think from the viewpoint of the Trump administration, the message being sent to Tehran is, look, the United States could pivot essentially on the proverbial dime to recognizing Syria and lifting sanctions. So the message being sent to Tehran is, reach a deal and we can lift sanctions. And I think from the viewpoint of Donald Trump personally as a businessman, he sees the Iranian market as a vastly untapped, vastly underdeveloped market with great potential, and lifting of sanctions would permit the United States to once again begin to work economically with Iran. Now, granting the lifting of sanctions would also therefore benefit China's economic relationship with Iran even further. But what I think the Trump administration gambles on is that if sanctions, if a nuclear deal were to be reached with Iran, if sanctions were to be lifted on Iran, then the ability of the United States to benefit from Iran's growing economy, and for Iran also to benefit from the United States would be a very great potential. So I think what the message being sent there is, look, rejoin the world community. All you have to do is essentially be willing to give up nuclear weapons for a particular period of time. And how this fits into Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the Emirates, Oman, etc., is, of course, that it would provide an additional degree of regional stability. I think the Gulf states at this point are far less worried, even without the Trump administration, about any military conflict with Iran. The Gulf states and Iran have worked together by themselves to dissipate those tensions. But I think the removal of the nuclear card will essentially help the entire region be, shall we say, calmer. It would also certainly benefit Israel as well. The removal of the Iran equation would possibly also enable the Israelis to once again become more active in the Middle East, despite the Gaza problem.
Professor Choksy, I want to end our conversation. Let's talk about the nation of Israel. And again, you and I, we are going back and forth on this topic that Trump skipped the visit to Israel during his trip to the Middle East. Now, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu once assumed that his relationship with the US, with Trump, was solid. But this time, that during the trip, it looked to me that Israel has little to offer this transactional president. So from your perspective, I want to wrap our conversation asking you, Professor Choksy, is how do we see the relationship between US and Israel to move forward? I mean, again, we've seen the deal or the possibility to make a deal with Iran, and also we've seen the continue the chaos in Gaza. How do you think Benjamin Netanyahu is able to plan the next move with Trump? Because ultimately, Israel still need Trump, but meanwhile, Trump, again, is playing this, what we called unorthodoxical diplomacy. Your thoughts?
I think that the way that Trump himself is approaching it is that he believes that his presidency would benefit from a deal with Iran and from strengthening ties with the Gulf Arab states. And I think he sees this separate from his relationship with Israel. And he feels that the Israeli government should not interfere with his moves to reach a deal with Iran. The Prime Minister Netanyahu would, of course, disagree very strongly, linking Israel's security to Iran not having any nuclear capability. I don't think that the President of the United States sees it that way. On the other hand, as we have also seen, the President of the United States is willing to give the Israeli government pretty free rein within the borders of Israel. So it appears that there's sort of a balancing act. And what Trump expects is that the Israelis would not interfere with his attempts to negotiate with Iran. Now, that may change. The Israelis may attempt to launch a preemptive strike. The problem, of course, is that by itself, Israel lacks that capability. It will not be successful. So I think at this point, the question is, do the Iranians reach a deal with Trump before Trump runs out of patience? And the unknown there is that Trump's limit of patience is the unknown. I think as long as Trump feels that he's getting towards a deal, and at the very least, if the Iranians can string him along, or better still, for the benefit of the entire region, if the Iranians were willing to reach a deal, it it would have massive consequences, because the other thing it would do, for example, is it would free Iran up to export its oil completely on the global market, which means that there will be greater flows of oil to China, to India, and to Southeast Asia. And so, in a sense, I would sort of conclude by saying that the ball at this point is in Tehran's field of play, and that this is an opportunity, I think, given that Trump would override any objections within the United States, within the United States Congress to a deal. This is the opportunity for Tehran to make a deal.
Well, I mean, again, whether Donald Trump continues to be this disruptor or continues to carry out this unorthodoxical diplomacy, the conclusion is the trip for Donald Trump to the Middle East was rather successful. I mean, we don't know how the seas will continue to grow in the international sense, but to China, to US, to Ukraine, to Russia, again, Professor Choksy, to borrow the words that you use, is patience. And patience takes time, and it takes time to strengthen and to build relationships. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's such an honor to have Professor Choksy on the show. And Professor Choksy, it's an international political scientist, and I strongly encourage everyone to go online to check out his publications. And again, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure. We'd love to have you back on the show as we continue to pay attention to those matters. So thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you so much, Will. And let us play all this out and watch the scene and see whether or not the President of the United States has enough patience. He doesn't need too much, but just enough patience to reach a few international deals, because those deals would have very great benefit. And including in those deals, I would say, is reaching a stable relationship once again with China.
That's right.
Which I think is very important. Because these are the two global superpowers, economically, militarily, and a deal there, I think, would boost global markets at the very least.
That's right. And also, to borrow the phrase from Winston Churchill, let's not wait until exhaust all the possibilities and then start to make the wise decision. All right. Thank you, Professor. Thank you so much for your time.
Great pleasure. Take care.
Very